everyone and welcome back to another Wizard101 video. First off, if this is uploaded late, I will say that I'm sorry. It snowed like 3 feet yesterday and I had to do a lot of shoveling this morning, so I definitely am recording this a bit later than what I would like, but hopefully I don't miss the deadline by that much. And second off, I will say this is becoming a series. I know that this is becoming a series. This is my 4th video on the different schools, and yes, I do probably plan on creating more. There's only one school that I'm not entirely sure what to talk about with, and that's ice, but hopefully I figure something out. But enough introduction, I'm sorry. Let's talk about what you came here for, which is the Fire School. I want to talk about the Fire School as a whole and how I think over time it became a bit unbalanced. Maybe not necessarily unbalanced, but it drifted away from what its initial purpose was and shifted to an entirely new one over time. And I want to kind of highlight that change and that shift and talk about whether I think it should have done that or not. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, let's talk about Fire's initial purpose, because Fire was created with an idea in mind. There was a reason why KingsIsle created Fire, and it had its own unique role. Fire was designed to be kind of a DPS overtime hitter, not an initial extremely powerful hitter. And I want to stress that a lot. There were different ideas for different hitting roles, because obviously, right, like Myth, Fire, Death, Storm all fit more into the hitting role than they do most other roles, and there needed to be something to differentiate each of them, right? Like Myth had their stuns and util, Storm just had massive amounts of damage and also a little bit of util tacked on, Death had their healbacks, and Fire had overtimes. Overtimes were basically just over rounds you would do a set amount of damage, and you can see that they really planned on that being Fire's focus in the beginning, right? Like they have Heckhound here, which does a lot of damage, 130 per pip over 3 rounds. That's really solid. They have Fire Elf, which obviously did the initial damage plus overtime. They had Link, which did damage plus overtime, then heal plus overtime. Realistically, you get my point. They wanted Fire to be the overtime school. Now, I would like to say, I think that they drifted away from this purpose drastically. Like they changed what they wanted Fire to be a few years ago, and Fire hasn't been the same since. So how did that happen and what happened? Well, initially with Fire and their damage overtimes, they had less damage than most other schools. Even in some cases, they had less damage than Storm, they had less damage than even Death, and that was towards the beginning of the game. You can very easily see what their intended stats were based on the Waterworks gear, I find. I find that the Waterworks gear is really good at telling what KingsIsle had in mind, where Life and Death and Storm had some of the most amounts of damage. Life was more to make up for the fact that their spells were a bit weaker, but definitely it shows that Fire's wasn't as powerful as Storm's, and I think that kind of showed what their initial plans for Fire were. Fire wasn't intended to be this massive hitter, but over time that shifted. I would say Malistaire gear, it was still Storm weighed out. Storm was still the massive heavy hitter that was designed to be the #1 hitter in the game, but something weird started happening, and this started happening around level 120, 125 in Imperia, I found. It started with kind of the Kabbalist gear and those types of gear sets. Fire started gaining more and more damage at a much faster rate, until eventually we got up to Dragoon gear, and by Dragoon gear, Fire had the most amount of damage out of any gear set in the game. And this holds true to today, obviously. Fire is still on top when it comes to different gear sets, and I find that to be really interesting. Somewhere along the lines, KingsIsle went, okay, Fire's main role shouldn't be doing a lot of damage but drawn out. It should be to do massive amounts of damage right away. And it also shows with the newer spells we were getting. Just look at some of these higher level spells. The last massive damage over time was Rain of Fire. A lot of these spells are not damage over times, and that was a really strange shift where Fire was taken from its role and placed into a new one. It was placed into the role of main hitter. That's really what I wanted to give for an exposition. I know that was kind of like a dramatic exposition, but now I kind of want to go into strengths and weaknesses, and then I want to go into what I personally think about Fire and why I think Fire is a little bit unbalanced. So let's start off with strengths. Obviously, just given based on that intro, you know Fire has a lot of damage. It has the most amount of damage by the end of the game, and that makes it really solid. One thing I'd like to point out, because I know some people will point this out, Storm's spells do have a higher base damage, but Fire's percent damage basically mitigates that. I would say right now, Storm's base damage on top of their actual damage puts them at about equal footing, with Fire having slightly higher actual damage and a slightly lower base damage. I would say that they're about equal in that regards now. But their strengths, and I find this is definitely important to know, is that they're like Storm, where they have a lot of damage, but they have less drawbacks than Storm. They are Storm, but in my opinion, better. They have more health, they can get more resist naturally, they have obviously more damage now in terms of the damage stat, and they can very easily focus on other stats as well. I would say Storm and Fire are just about equal in terms of most other stats, except Fire has 7,000 health and Storm has like 6,000. So that's the main difference between the two. Fire also obviously has the strengths of massive overtimes. I know that I said that they're focusing on it less, but they still have a lot of overtimes that are really useful in a lot of fights and really good. I think that's basically it for strengths. Obviously, there's some other things I can list, but the main thing I want to emphasize this video is that Fire's main strength is that they are a really, really good hitter. They are just a massive cannon that's able to do massive amounts of damage and doesn't have too many drawbacks. I'm sure most people actually know that, and that's why Fire tends to be the #1 hitter. Even sometimes over a Storm, Fire will be picked as a hitter now. And that really illustrates what Fire's strength is to be a really solid hitter. In terms of weaknesses, I would say their main weakness is resist, similar to Storm, where they have a naturally low resist. Obviously this can get a bit higher, but that's their main issue. They also have some accuracy issues, but those are largely solved by the time you get to a higher level. Fire doesn't have too many weaknesses, I would say. Its main weakness is its lack of defense. The only real scary thing is probably once you get up to Lemuria and the enemies start hitting like trucks. That can be a bit scary as a Fire. It can definitely be scary as a Storm, but as long as you have people there with you, or you're prepared and you have some resists, maybe a triple double pet, you'll be absolutely fine. So now what I want to talk about, I really want to analyze what KingsIsle did. I know I mentioned it in the beginning of the video and I talked about how Fire shifted, but I really want to talk about what I think about that. Personally, I don't think they should have done what they did. Fire should have stayed in its overtime role and been a more DPS rather than a massive hitter like Storm is. Now, the main reason why I say this, I'm not even saying that I dislike Fire being powerful, because obviously my main is Fire. I play on Fire a lot and I love Fire. I don't want it to be weaker. Why do I say that it's bad? Well, because it completely invalidates Storm. I'm just gonna outright say it at this point. One of the main reasons why I dislike Storm is because Storm is completely invalidated by Fire at this point. With Fire's damage compared to Storm's, with the base damage of their spells now, Fire is pretty much equal in all accounts to Storm, except they have more health. So really, all KingsIsle managed to do with these changes to Fire was completely invalidate Storm's role. Now, obviously, do I still think Storm is useful? Do I still want a Storm on my team? Sure, but if it keeps going down this trend, like if we keep getting so that Fire gets exponentially more powerful than Storm, we're gonna see some problems. Because I'm gonna say it, like, if I had 180 damage, I don't know the exact math on this, and I'm way too lazy to do it, but I will do it eventually. With 180 damage versus a Storm's 160, I'm pretty sure Fire would be on pace with their hits most of the time, and they just don't have that downside of the health reduction. So realistically, that's my problem with Fire. I will say what I think KingsIsle should do, and obviously at this point it's a little bit too late. I don't want them to nerf Fire into the ground. I think that's the problem with these types of things, is that when they make something too strong, it's very hard to nerf it because the fan base will be in an uproar. What I think they should do is they should start making Storm have more damage, or at least on par with Fire. If they made Fire and Storm have the same amount of damage, except Storm's spells had higher base damage, that would effectively solve this issue. It would keep Storm at that role. But instead, Fire is getting more and more powerful to the point where I'm pretty sure at the rate we're going in a few years, Storm is going to be completely useless. Fire is always going to be the better option. And I really don't don't want to see that. I know that I rag on Storm all the time, and, you know, I make fun of it, but that doesn't mean I want to see a school completely fall to the wayside. I don't want to see them be useless. So that's really it for today. I am very curious to what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Fire is fine the way it is, or do you think that Storm needs to be buffed? I personally think they could very easily fix this change. All you need is 1 or 2 updates. The next gear set, have Storm have slightly more damage, maybe make it similar or the same as Fire, if not only slightly less. But at the rate we're going right now, Fire is getting more and more powerful compared to Storm at a rate that I don't think is comfortable. But that's it for today. Again, let me know. I am very curious to hear what you think. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Adios.